I think we ought to skip the message and just listen to more of that. I've always loved that instrument. It's just such a wonderful sound. Well, normally when Daleth invites me to speak, she doesn't give me an assignment, but she did this time. She said that she wanted me to speak on forgiveness, and I think this was a divine appointment because this is something that I've been doing a lot of soul work on the last several years, and very intensely, I would say the last 6 months in particular. I've been doing this kind of work because a number of years ago, I was deeply hurt by some people very close to me, and no apology ever at all came along with that. Forgiveness can be one of the hardest things for us to offer, especially when the other person isn't sorry for what they did. Decades ago, I felt God calling me to be a tzaddik. A tzaddik is a righteous person, good person. It was a dramatic encounter with a text that I was reading at the time. I was actually sitting, believe it or not, on a rickety folding chair in my kids' dojo as they were practicing their martial arts. And I was reading this book by a Jewish scholar, and he said, a tzaddik is one who does no harm. And a tzaddik is someone who, when folks come into contact with them, they feel as if they were in the presence of God. And that hit me in a very dramatic way. And there's been numerous other times I don't have time to go into now. I have largely ignored that call. But I think I'm finally embracing this later in life in a very intentional way, at least I hope I am. And I'm hoping that this will be my focus for my remaining years that I have to live and of my teaching. So in a way, I could be thankful that this hurt was done to me because it's helped me to embrace this original calling. I know I'll never get there, so I call myself a wannabe tzaddik. I'm actually thinking of a yarmulke with that stitched on it or something. The major source book that I've been working on this past several months is by one of my favorite authors, Rabbi Abraham Twersky, who not only was a rabbi, but was a psychiatrist. And he did a lot of clinical work, in particular in Alcoholics Anonymous, but in many other settings as well. And he wrote this book called Forgiveness, Don't Let Resentment Keep You Captive. And I highly recommend it. One thing that I've come to realize is that there really are at least two kinds of people who do harm. There are those who deliberately harm us. These people genuinely mean to be mean or rude or to do some kind of damage to you. But then there's also people who do inadvertent harm. They just might hurt you just because of who they are. And this is true of all of us. We all have different personalities and preferences and thoughts. We have different past wounds that will come to surface as we interact with others. We have different learned behaviors. And sometimes even just being yourself can hurt someone else. On the way over here, I thought of a kind of humorous example of this I hadn't thought about in years. When my first child was very little, I had a minister say to me, he's quite the thinker. It was all in his head, right? It was very innocent. He was a great guy. But he says to me one day, given you and your wife, your daughter has no hope of being thin when she grows up. And, I gave him grace but that's an example of somebody who's just not thinking about what impact they might have. And it could be very damaging to people. And to be honest, I know I've probably hurt others just because of being who I am. It's just the reality of the situation. And I experienced both of these in the last several years. People that deliberately meant me harm and people that's just them being them. I also love a quote that's been attributed to Denzel Washington. I've seen this online many times. I don't know if it's true or not, but that he said it. You can't trust the internet. But he said, some people will never like you because your spirit irritates their inner demons. And I think that's true. It really is true. I'm the kind of person that could see humor in anything. I used to drive my boss crazy years ago because he would be so upset about some conflict or trouble we were having at work, and I'd be cracking a joke, and it just drove him nuts. When we get hurt, anger is natural. The title of this is Rage, Reaction, and Resentment, the Jewish Path to Reconciliation. So the first step here is the rage part. When we're hurt, anger is natural. It's built into us. It's part of who we are. The key is what we do with this. Do we harm others? Do we react in kind? Or do we direct it into positive ways? Rage can have a lot of strength because we have not dealt with anger from our past. Rabbi Twersky in his book uses the image of a jack-in-the-box. And he says if you keep stuffing your anger down, it builds up pressure until one day it just bursts out violently like the clown popping up out of the box. And I never really understood subconscious in the way that he described it, which makes just a lot of sense. He says our preconscious is stuff that we can access from our memories, right? So if I say to you, hey, remember the time we went to the baseball game 20 years ago, and you haven't thought about it in years, and all of a sudden you're like, yeah, and all of a sudden you can recall all these things. That's pre-consciousness. Our subconscious we can't access, but stuff gets stuffed down in there, and it becomes this well that can be of things good or bad, useful or not. So this is why sometimes people are very shocked at a strong reaction that somebody has that might even be a seemingly mild offense. I worked with a woman years ago who reacted violently to even the slightest critique. And I was always puzzled by this until one day she shared with me that her mother was hypercritical. And I realized this has just been this, thing that's built up inside of her, and she hasn't dealt with it, and so her reaction was very powerful. The other problem is rage could feel good, right? We could be the righteous victim. Again, Rabbi Twersky says he likens this to hoarders, which I thought was a great analogy. He said, my mom grew up in the Depression, and when we moved her out of my childhood home, I found about 50 oatmeal canisters in the basement, those cylindrical ones, Quaker Oats, because she was gonna use them someday. They went in the trash. What Twersky says is that we hoard anger and resentment because we're thinking that just someday we're going to be able to use it and we'll get our vindication. But the reality is it's not likely to happen. Anger is so common that we see it addressed both throughout the Torah, the Old Testament, and the Bisarah, the New Testament. In Psalm 4:4 it says, you could be angry, but do not sin. Think about this as you lie in bed and calm down. Proverbs 14:29, whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but one who has a hasty temper exalts folly. Again in Proverbs, better a patient person than a warrior, one with self-control than one who can take a city. And in the book of James, Yaakov, this is Yeshua's brother, it says, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And Jesus himself drew an analogy of anger as akin to murder in his Sermon on the Mount. In the Talmud, the body of Jewish law, it says one who becomes angry is as if he was an idolater. There's a famous rabbi who lived in the 11th century. He goes by the name of Rambam. And he said one should distance himself from anger to the utmost until he acts as though he does not even feel the things that would naturally arouse anger. So it is natural for us to have anger when we're assaulted in some way, but how do we handle that? How do we react? There's an old story told about a young disciple walking down the road with his rabbi, and some Gentiles start hurling anti-Semitic insults at them. And the disciple is outraged and he responds in kind. And his teacher says to him as they're walking away, I thought that you were a true son of the Torah. And he says, what do you mean? How should I have handled this situation? And he says, a true son of the Torah doesn't react. Our inclination is to react, to lash out, to do harm, but this only perpetuates all of the hatred and discord that we experience. In Ephesians 4, it says, in your anger, do not sin. The Baal Shem Tov, who was a very famous rabbi, lived in the 1700s, said, a small hole can cause a great barrel to leak. So too, a little anger can cause great spiritual damage. So how do we do this? Well, are you guys familiar with the martial art of Aikido? This was invented by Morihei Ueshiba, if I'm saying his name right. And the whole concept of this is to deal with an attacker, but you redirect their momentum in a way that neutralizes the attack without injuring the attacker, if at all possible. We redirect the attack, and he says, which I just think is amazing, you're defending not only yourself, but the attacker. You're defending the attacker. We need to earn black belts in spiritual Aikido. And just like a martial artist trains for years in preparation for ultimately maybe someday having to use it, we have to train ourselves spiritually as well. We have to deal with the pent-up anger. Perhaps this includes therapy, which is something I've been doing for the last couple of years, to face those past hurts, to dig into those complexes that are built into our subconscious mind, to practice prayer and meditation in silence, building a habit of that quiet so when the wound comes, we have space to respond in a wholesome way instead of just reacting in a negative way. And I think self-reflection is very critical. Am I seeing this situation correctly? Because again, our subconsciouses can jump to conclusions about what that person's intending when they did or said the thing that they did. Are my own wounds twisting what I am perceiving? I also realized as I was struggling with my anger and resentment is that it really helps to take the stance of father with other people. that we can, I was thinking of my own children, when my son was very little, I got him a Lord of the Rings ring as a gift, and he lost it in the backyard. And he bawled and wailed after we spent like an hour trying to find that thing. It's probably still laying in the yard of that old house, 25 years later. He was so heartbroken. And as a father, I could see his pain. I could see his grief, but knowing it's not that big of a deal, I could buy you another ring, But so seeing other people from this stance, not a stance of haughtiness, but a stance of like a distant realization that this is a person who themselves have faults. They are not perfect. They're growing. They're immature. They may have a limited perspective. If we see others in this light as flawed human beings, that despite their misbehavior, they're still children of God, and they deserve our compassion and understanding. This gives us distance. And again, not talking about apathy, but of a compassionate love from a distance. The father, but then I realized there's another aspect to this. I left out the mother. Patriarch wins. But it didn't, because I thought of the mother. If you think about it, a father typically is the one that pushes, encourages, causes the children to stretch and do things. They're typically the disciplinarian. They act more like a judge or a coach. Coaches make you, I played football. Coaches make you do things you don't want to do. But it's for your good. And so we too can have that stance of father with compassion. And this is, I got to keep an eye on the time, because I know I probably got more here than I got. What am I going to? Like 5 more minutes? Yeah, I'm in trouble. Okay, I'll skip on. The mother typically is the one that cuddles and cares and heals and nurtures, and she acts more like a counselor or as a nurse. We need to take both of these stances. We need to have that distance with other people so that we can see them more clearly and be able to not react. But then we also need to be willing to embrace them and to love them in the midst of their ugliness. And this really reflects the concept of God's transcendence and immanence, right? You have God as above all of creation, as like the Father, and then you have God intimately involved and loving his creation as the mother. Okay, resentment is the third one. Even if we don't act inappropriately outwardly, resentment can take root inside of us, as I well know. We have to face this and root it out. The Buddha said resentment is like drinking poison hoping the other person dies. You've probably heard that quote before. It's a fairly famous one, but so appropriate. And I realized that there is a prayer that you say when in the Jewish liturgy when you go to bed at night. And I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to it until just recently, believe it or not. And it's a prayer that says, may I forgive everyone who has hurt me intentionally or inadvertently. Wow, that's amazing. What a prayer. And you're praying that, it dawned on me, that's not just a prayer, that's like an intention that you're trying to live up to, right? It's going to take time for you to get there. But it's a way of like every day reminding yourself that this is the stance to take. And then it goes on to ask God to forgive us of our sins. And it dawned on me, it's just like what Yeshua said, that we are to forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. Also, to deal with resentment is to remember that we are all flawed. Resentment loves to whisper to us, you're perfect, but they're awful, right? You deserve to stay angry. So remembering that we are flawed too allows us to give grace to other people and recognize that they are flawed as well. There's another rabbi who said, everyone should carry 2 papers in each pocket. The one says, for me, the whole universe was created. And the other one says, I'm but a pile of dust and ashes. And it's living in that balanced in-between area that's good for us. Again, back to the Baal Shem Tov, this 18th century rabbi, he said, when we judge others, it's like we're breaking the 2nd commandment, thinking we're God, right? I'm perfect. It's that person, that schmuck. We also, Jewish tradition says, we also need to see it as a lesson of opportunity. Again, back to the Baal Shem Tov. He says, when we see flaws in others, it's often a mirror showing something in ourselves. And so he encourages us to take that stance. This person's offending me. Now, what am I seeing in me? Rather than focusing so much on the other person. Another very famous rabbi from the, I think he lived around the 1700s as well. He said, don't call someone or something bad. Call it bitter. This allows us to recognize that person's worth and that it's also a lesson for us, even if it is a bitter lesson. And this made me think of the verse, all things work to the good of those who love God. Even these damaging attacks can be for our good. Love is not an emotion. When we read that term love, we think sort of in our modern Western mindset of that being like an emotion, right? We're supposed to love God, love others. In the Hebrew, it's better translated as devotion or faithfulness. Are we going to be faithful and devoted to God and to the good of others? And a realization I had many years ago is that verse, all things work to good of the love of the Lord, includes my mistakes, right? I'd never thought about that before. Another thing is to give yourself time to heal. There's a story where a man comes to a rabbi begging his forgiveness, and the rabbi says, come back in 2 weeks. And 2 weeks later, he comes back and he says, I forgive you. And he says, okay, Rabbi, thank you, but why 2 weeks? He says, I needed to work through my resentment so that I could truly say to you, I forgive you. So give yourself time to heal. Forgiveness is especially hard, like I said, when there's no apology forthcoming. The normal cycle of events that we'd like to have is what I just told you the story about. We'd like to have the person say, I'm sorry, I did this wrong to you, and then you offer them forgiveness, right? And then there's reconciliation to that, right? You've now restored the relationship. But if the person isn't willing to apologize or to acknowledge that they did wrong, then there's no repentance, there's no reconciliation, there's no true forgiveness. But the rabbis have our back. They say, salicha is the Hebrew word for forgiveness when somebody asks you to forgive them. But there's another type of forgiveness. It's one that God uses a lot with us. Mechila, which is, even though you owe me a debt, I'm going to release it, right? Even though you didn't say you're sorry, I'm going to release it. Rabbi Twersky, again, his book said, when you hold on to resentment, you allow the offender to hurt you over and over again in your heart. But I also want to just say real quickly, because I know I'm over, forgiveness is not being a doormat. We need to set boundaries. We need to protect ourselves while we're releasing the anger. We can love someone from a distance, Sometimes you just have to do that. I have a family member who is incredibly narcissistic, and I have to love that person from a bit of a distance because it's just too much. So in conclusion, forgiveness is not a one-time act, it's a daily practice, and it's a work of walking in the footsteps of God. It's not easy, it's not quick, but it is freeing, I can tell you. Because when we let go of the rage and the reaction, the resentment, we become free to live better, to love better, and to heal. May we all do the hard work of self-awareness, prayer, and meditation. May we all seek to prepare ourselves in advance for the inevitable onslaught that will come against us. May we all earn black belts in spiritual Aikido, and thereby we will become tzaddiks, righteous people, doing no harm and sharing God's grace and forgiveness. Thank you.